The morning I found my American flag in the garbage can, still attached to the pole I'd mounted with military precision, I knew someone had made a terrible mistake. Not because they'd disrespected the flag I'd served 30 years to protect, but because they had no idea they'd just declared war on a Marine general who'd never lost a single battle. Picture this, 7:15 a.m., perfect Texas morning, and I'm standing in my driveway in Willowbrook Estates holding Old Glory like I'm cradling a fallen Marine. The smell of fresh garbage mixed with morning dew, and my own rising fury as I stared at the violation notice taped to my front door. Unauthorized flagpole installation creates visual pollution and violates community aesthetic standards. Remove immediately or face $500 daily fines. Patricia Whitman, HOA President. What would you do if someone threw your country's flag in the trash and fined you for patriotism? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I bet half of you have dealt with power-hungry HOA bullies who think their clipboard makes them untouchable. Let me back up and tell you how a decorated Marine general ended up in suburban hell, because this story starts with heartbreak and ends with the most satisfying justice you'll ever witness. My name is Marcus Thompson, and 6 months before this flag incident, I was sitting in Walter Reed Medical Center watching pancreatic cancer steal my wife Sarah's last breath. She was 54, the kind of woman who could command respect in any room while making everyone feel like family. Sarah had been an Army nurse for 25 years, meeting me during a field hospital rotation in Afghanistan, where she saved more lives than most people meet in a lifetime. After the funeral, our Arlington house felt like a museum of memories too painful to visit daily. Every corner held echoes of her laughter. Every room carried the scent of her vanilla perfume, mixed with the medical textbooks she'd never finished reading. Our daughter Emma was starting her junior year at Georgetown, and our son Michael had just shipped out for his first deployment with the 82nd Airborne. The house was too big, too quiet, too full of ghosts for a man who'd spent 3 decades surrounded by Marines, who'd follow orders even if it meant charging into hell. I needed space to grieve, distance from the political circus of Washington, and a place where Sarah's memory could rest peacefully. Willowbrook Estates seemed perfect, a quiet Texas community 2 hours from Fort Sam, Houston, where military families appreciated service and neighbors respected each other's space. The realtor, a former Air Force captain named Janet Morris, showed me a beautiful colonial on half an acre with enough room for Sarah's rose garden and a proper flagpole where Old Glory could fly with the dignity she deserved. The first 3 months were exactly what I'd hoped for. Quiet mornings on the back patio reading military history books, afternoon walks past houses where American flags flew proudly from professional installations, and evenings working in Sarah's memorial garden, where her favorite roses bloomed like prayers answered. The neighbors were good people, veterans, teachers, small business owners, who'd wave when they saw me checking the mail and bring homemade cookies during holidays. I should have known peace wouldn't last. It never does when entitled people mistake temporary power for permanent authority. Enter Patricia Whitman, 57 years old, HOA President for 4 consecutive terms, and the kind of woman who treats Homeowners Association bylaws like constitutional law. Picture someone who considers grocery store parking lot confrontations a recreational activity. She drives a white BMW that's never seen dirt and wears designer tracksuits to neighborhood meetings like she's heading to some exclusive country club instead of arguing about mailbox heights. Patricia moved to Willowbrook Estates 5 years ago from California, bringing with her an arsenal of HOA horror stories and an obsession with property values that bordered on mental illness. She'd turned what used to be a friendly neighborhood into a surveillance state where residents lived in fear of violation notices and neighbors reported each other for infractions that existed only in Patricia's twisted interpretation of community standards. My first encounter with Patricia happened during my second week in the neighborhood. I was installing Sarah's memorial rose bushes when this woman appeared in my yard like some suburban vampire, clipboard clutched against her chest and iPhone already recording. "Excuse me," she announced without introducing herself. "Those roses appear to be non-native varieties that may violate our landscaping guidelines. I'll need to see permits and soil composition reports before you proceed." I stood up slowly, brushing dirt from my hands while studying this creature who'd invaded my property without invitation. "Ma'am, I'm planting roses in memory of my deceased wife. These are the same varieties she grew for 20 years. I don't need permits to honor her memory on my own land." Patricia's smile was colder than a North Korean winter. "Everyone needs permits in Willowbrook Estates, Mr. Thompson. We maintain high standards here, and newcomers don't get to ignore rules because of personal circumstances. I'll expect compliance documentation by Friday, or you'll receive violation notices." She turned and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there holding Sarah's roses and wondering what kind of hell I'd moved into. That night, I called Emma at Georgetown and told her about the encounter. Her response was pure Sarah. "Dad, you spent 3 decades commanding Marines who die for you. Don't let some suburban dictator with a clipboard push you around. Mom would have destroyed that woman with kindness and Southern charm, then buried her in paperwork." Emma was right. Sarah would have handled Patricia with grace, intelligence, and strategic patience. But Sarah wasn't here anymore, and I was starting to understand that Patricia Whitman represented everything I'd spent my military career fighting against: abuse of power, intimidation of good people, and the belief that authority comes from position rather than character. The Rose Garden incident was just Patricia's opening salvo. Over the next month, I received violation notices for grass height variations of less than half an inch, mailbox positioning that allegedly violated sightline regulations, and exterior paint that didn't match the approved color palette despite being identical to 3 other houses on the street. Each notice demanded immediate compliance plus administrative fees ranging from $50 to $200. Each notice threatened escalating fines and potential legal action for non-compliance. Each notice was signed by Patricia Whitman with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found her life's calling in tormenting her neighbors. I paid the first few fines while researching Texas property law and HOA regulations, looking for legal ammunition I could use to fight back. What I discovered made my blood pressure spike like incoming artillery. Patricia had been systematically targeting military families, elderly residents, and anyone who'd ever questioned her authority during neighborhood meetings. The Henderson family received 17 violation notices in 6 months after John Henderson suggested the annual budget should include line item transparency. Margaret Walsh, an 81-year-old widow, was fined repeatedly for bird feeders that allegedly attracted pests, despite similar feeders throughout the neighborhood receiving no violations. The Martinez family faced constant harassment over their teenage son's basketball hoop, while identical installations remained untouched. Patricia's pattern was textbook bullying disguised as community leadership. Target the vulnerable, isolate them from community support, then escalate pressure until they either comply with unreasonable demands or sell their homes and leave. I'd seen the same tactics used by warlords in Afghanistan who controlled villages through fear and arbitrary punishment. But Patricia made one critical miscalculation. She assumed I was just another suburbanite who'd fold under pressure from someone with official-sounding authority. She had no idea she was dealing with someone who'd stared down Taliban commanders, negotiated with hostile foreign governments, and built a 30-year military career on the principle that bullies only understand strength. The flagpole installation was my line in the sand, not because I wanted to provoke confrontation, but because that flag represented everything Sarah and I had dedicated our lives to protecting: the Constitution, the freedom to live peacefully on your own property, and the right to honor service members who'd sacrificed everything for those principles. I researched flag display regulations with the same thoroughness I'd once used for military intelligence assessments. Federal flag code, Texas state law, municipal ordinances, and HOA covenant restrictions. My installation met or exceeded every requirement while following military protocol for proper flag display and maintenance. The flagpole was professional-grade aluminum, anchored in concrete footings that could withstand hurricane-force winds. The flag was all-weather nylon, properly illuminated for 24-hour display, and mounted at regulation height with appropriate clearances. I'd even consulted with the city planning office to verify compliance with all local requirements. 3 days after installation, Patricia appeared in my driveway at 6:45 a.m. like some twisted suburban Santa Claus, delivering citations instead of presents. This time, she brought backup: 2 other HOA board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. "Mr. Thompson, your flagpole violates multiple community standards," she announced, consulting her clipboard like it contained nuclear launch codes. Height restrictions, aesthetic guidelines, and installation requirements all clearly prohibit unauthorized structures that create visual pollution. I stepped onto my front porch wearing my Marine Corps coffee mug and the kind of smile that had once made enemy combatants reconsider their life choices. "Ma'am, that flag is displayed in accordance with federal regulations and Texas state law. Both supersede any HOA restrictions that might conflict with constitutional rights." Patricia's face flushed red as a stop sign. "Constitutional rights don't override community standards, Mr. Thompson. This is private property governed by covenants you agreed to follow when you purchased your home. Remove the flagpole or face escalating fines starting at $500 per day." The two board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing they were witnessing something bigger than a routine HOA violation. One of them, a nervous-looking accountant named Dave Stevens, actually stepped back when I fixed him with the kind of stare that had once made subordinates check their uniforms twice. "Ma'am," I said quietly, my voice carrying 30 years of command authority, "I've defended that flag in combat zones where people died protecting what it represents. I'm not removing it because someone with a clipboard thinks patriotism creates visual pollution." Patricia's clipboard trembled slightly, but her suburban tyranny was too deeply ingrained to back down from what she perceived as defiance of her authority. "You have 48 hours, Mr. Thompson. After that, we'll explore all available legal options to ensure compliance with community standards." As they walked away, I heard Dave Stevens whisper to the other board member, something about maybe they should research this more carefully before escalating. But Patricia was already planning her next assault, probably fantasizing about the moment she'd humiliate the stubborn new resident who dared challenge her authority. That evening, I called my former aide-de-camp, Colonel Jennifer Walsh, now working at the Pentagon in military legal affairs. Jennifer had served under me in Iraq and Afghanistan, handling everything from court-martials to international legal disputes with the precision of a Swiss watch and the tenacity of a honey badger. "General," she said after I explained the situation, "you're dealing with what we call civilian command confusion." She thinks her little HOA gives her authority over federal law and constitutional rights. She's about to learn why that's a very bad assumption. Jennifer connected me with Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Kim, a military lawyer specializing in veteran rights and housing discrimination. Sarah had handled dozens of cases involving HOA harassment of military families, and her track record was impressive enough to make opposing attorneys consider career changes. "General Thompson," Sarah explained during our video call, "federal law provides multiple protections for flag display by military personnel, both active and retired. The freedom to display. The American Flag Act specifically prohibits HOA restrictions on flag display that conflict with federal guidelines. You're not just legally right, you're constitutionally protected." But Sarah's next revelation made my day considerably brighter. I've been monitoring HOA harassment complaints across Texas, and Willowbrook Estates has generated more formal complaints than any other development in the county. Your Patricia Whitman is already on the radar of state housing authorities for potential civil rights violations. The 48-hour deadline came and went without me touching my flagpole. Instead, I spent those 2 days documenting every previous violation notice I'd received, researching similar harassment complaints from other residents, and building a legal foundation that would make Patricia's legal threats look like playground insults. On the third morning, Patricia appeared in my driveway at 7 a.m., sharp with a photographer, a clipboard full of violation notices, and the kind of smug satisfaction that suggested she thought she was about to win this battle decisively. She spent 10 minutes photographing my flagpole from multiple angles while dictating observations into a voice recorder, like she was documenting war crimes. "Mr. Thompson," she called loudly enough for neighbors to hear, "your continued noncompliance with community standards has resulted in escalated violation procedures. You now face $500 daily fines, plus administrative costs and potential legal action to force removal of unauthorized installations." I stepped onto my front porch holding my morning coffee and the kind of documentation that would soon turn Patricia's world upside down. "Ma'am, before you continue with your violation procedures, I think you should know that your actions are being monitored by federal housing authorities for potential civil rights violations targeting military families." Patricia's smug expression flickered like a television with bad reception. "That's completely false," she said, but her voice carried less confidence than it had 30 seconds earlier. I opened my folder and began reading from Lieutenant Colonel Kim's legal assessment. The the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act, Title IV, U.S.C. Section 8, specifically prohibits homeowners associations from restricting flag display by military personnel when such display complies with federal guidelines. Violation of this federal law constitutes a civil rights offense punishable by substantial fines and potential criminal charges. The photographer stopped taking pictures, clearly uncomfortable with the legal terminology flying around what he'd assumed would be a simple property documentation assignment. Patricia's clipboard trembled slightly as she realized this wasn't going according to her standard intimidation playbook. Furthermore, I continued, systematic harassment of military families based on their service-related property displays falls under federal housing discrimination laws. The Department of Housing and Urban Development takes these violations very seriously, particularly when there's a documented pattern of targeting protected classes. Patricia's face had progressed through several interesting colors, finally settling on a shade of pale green that matched her BMW's interior. Mr. Thompson, this is clearly a misunderstanding. The HOA simply maintains consistent community standards for all residents without regard to personal circumstances. Ma'am, I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded attention in Pentagon briefings. I've spent 30 years protecting the Constitution and the rights it guarantees. I'm not about to let someone with a clipboard violate those rights in the name of community standards. The photographer was already packing his equipment, probably sensing that this assignment was about to become more complicated than he'd bargained for. Patricia clutched her clipboard like a drowning woman holding driftwood, but her suburban dictator facade was cracking faster than ice in Texas heat. I think there might be room for compromise, she said weakly, clearly recognizing that she'd picked a fight with someone who'd brought military-grade ammunition to her clipboard battle. Ma'am, there's no compromise on constitutional rights. My flag stays exactly where it is, displayed with the honor and respect it deserves. Any further harassment regarding this matter will be forwarded directly to federal housing authorities and the Department of Veterans Affairs. Patricia retreated faster than the Iraqi Republican Guard, trailing her photographer and clutching her violated authority like a security blanket. But I knew this wasn't over. People like Patricia don't surrender easily, especially when their perceived power is challenged by someone they assume they could intimidate. That afternoon, Jennifer Walsh called with updates that made my strategic heart sing with joy. General, she said, laughing like we'd just pulled off a successful military operation, your HOA president just made the biggest mistake of her civilian life. She filed a formal complaint with the county claiming you're violating federal flag display laws. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a bayonet. Patricia had actually contacted federal authorities to complain that my flag display violated federal regulations, apparently unaware that those same authorities would investigate her harassment of a military family under federal civil rights laws. The county forwarded her complaint to the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General, where it landed on the desk of someone who'd served under me in Afghanistan. Major General Robert Hayes, now Deputy Inspector General for Housing Affairs, called me personally within hours of receiving Patricia's complaint. Marcus, he said, his voice carrying the warmth of a shared combat experience and mutual respect, I understand you're dealing with some suburban terrorist who thinks she outranks the United States Constitution. Would you mind if we looked into this situation more thoroughly? Bob, I replied, feeling like Christmas morning had arrived early. I'd be honored to have the Inspector General's office review this matter. Patricia Whitman appears to believe that HOA authority supersedes federal law and constitutional rights. Within 72 hours, the Department of Veterans Affairs had opened a formal investigation into housing discrimination against military families in Willowbrook Estates. The investigation included not just my flag harassment, but the systematic targeting of other veteran residents that Patricia had been conducting for years. The Henderson family, whose patriarch had served 2 tours in Vietnam, received an official inquiry about their experiences with HOA harassment. Margaret Walsh's late husband had been a Korean War veteran, and her bird feeder violations suddenly looked like potential discrimination against a Gold Star widow. Even the Martinez family qualified for investigation, since their son was a Navy ROTC at Texas A&M. But Patricia's nuclear-level miscalculation was just getting started. The federal investigation triggered a mandatory review of all HOA financial records, governance procedures, and compliance with fair housing laws. What investigators found made my flag harassment look like a misdemeanor compared to the felonies Patricia had been committing for years. The HOA's financial records revealed a criminal enterprise that would have impressed organized crime bosses. Patricia had been systematically embezzling funds for over 3 years, disguising theft as legitimate administrative expenses while creating fake vendors and phantom projects that existed only on paper. The landscaping contract that supposedly cost $48,000 annually, the company was owned by her brother-in-law, and the actual work was performed by minimum wage workers who received less than $12,000 per year. The community enhancement projects were masterpieces of creative theft. $85,000 for playground renovations that consisted of power washing existing equipment. $62,000 for security system upgrades that involved replacing 4 cameras with identical models. $130,000 for road maintenance that amounted to filling 3 potholes with cold patch asphalt. But Patricia's most audacious theft involved the community pool renovation project. Homeowners had been assessed a special fee of $1,500 each to fund comprehensive pool upgrades, including new filtration systems, deck resurfacing, and equipment replacement. The project supposedly cost $375,000, but investigation revealed that Patricia had pocketed over $200,000 while performing minimal cosmetic work that cost less than $50,000 to complete. The vendor contracts were equally fraudulent. Patricia's cleaning company received monthly payments of $4,000 for common area maintenance, while the actual cleaning was performed by her teenage nephews for $200 per month. Her landscaping business charged premium rates for weekly lawn service throughout the development, but homeowners were maintaining their own yards while paying for services they never received. Each fraudulent transaction had been carefully documented in HOA financial records that Patricia controlled completely, with no oversight or independent auditing. She'd created fake invoices, forged vendor signatures, and submitted false expense reports with the confidence of someone who believed her authority was absolute and permanent. Lieutenant Colonel Kim called with updates that sounded like victory reports from a successful military campaign. "General," she said, her voice carrying excitement, that reminded me of successful operations briefings, your flag case has uncovered what appears to be systematic financial fraud, housing discrimination, and potential racketeering violations. The FBI's white-collar crime unit has joined the investigation, and they're treating this as a major federal case. The scope of Patricia's criminal activity was staggering. Financial analysts had discovered over $800,000 in stolen funds, affecting every homeowner in the development for multiple years. The discrimination complaints involved not just military families, but elderly residents, minorities, and anyone who'd ever questioned Patricia's authority during community meetings. The pattern of harassment was so systematic that federal investigators classified it as organized criminal activity. Patricia had created detailed files on every resident, documenting personal information, family circumstances, and potential vulnerabilities she could exploit through selective enforcement of HOA regulations. Military families were targeted specifically because Patricia assumed they'd move frequently and wouldn't establish long-term legal resistance to her harassment campaigns. The psychological warfare was particularly cruel. Patricia had researched deployed family members and timed her harassment to coincide with military deployments, knowing that spouses left behind would be more vulnerable to intimidation and less likely to fight back against HOA authority. She'd targeted families dealing with PTSD, medical issues, and financial stress from military service, exploiting their vulnerabilities to maintain control over the community. Special Agent Santos revealed that Patricia's criminal activity extended beyond simple embezzlement into sophisticated white-collar crime that involved multiple federal violations. She'd used interstate banking systems to launder stolen funds, created fake business entities to hide her theft, and filed false tax returns to avoid reporting her illegal income to federal authorities. The mail fraud charges alone were sufficient to guarantee substantial prison time. Patricia had used the United States Postal Service to deliver fraudulent violation notices, fake vendor invoices, and threatening letters to residents who'd questioned her authority. Each piece of mail constituted a separate federal felony that carried potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison. The wire fraud charges were equally serious. Patricia had used electronic banking systems, email communications, and digital document creation to facilitate her criminal enterprise. She'd forged electronic signatures, created fake email accounts to impersonate vendors, and transferred stolen funds through multiple bank accounts to hide the money trail from federal investigators. But the most serious charges involve civil rights violations that transformed Patricia's harassment campaign into federal hate crimes. The systematic targeting of military families based on their service status violated federal housing discrimination laws that carried enhanced penalties and mandatory minimum prison sentences. The investigation expanded to include Patricia's network of enablers and co-conspirators. Several HOA board members had received kickbacks for approving fraudulent contracts, while others had remained silent about obvious financial irregularities in exchange for reduced harassment of their own families. The property management company had facilitated Patricia's theft by providing false financial reports and failing to maintain adequate oversight of community funds. Agent Santos explained that federal prosecutors were building what she called a textbook RICO case, treating Patricia's HOA like an organized criminal enterprise that had systematically violated federal laws for multiple years. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act allowed prosecutors to seek enhanced penalties for criminal organizations that engaged in patterns of illegal activity affecting interstate commerce. The FBI. Patricia's clipboard tyranny had escalated into a federal criminal investigation involving multiple agencies and potential prison time. The woman who'd thrown my flag in the garbage was about to face the full weight of federal law enforcement. 3 weeks after Patricia's complaint had backfired spectacularly, I received a phone call that made my day brighter than Texas sunshine. Special Agent Maria Santos from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division needed to interview me about my experiences with HOA harassment and any knowledge I might have regarding financial irregularities. Agent Santos arrived at my house the following morning, a professional woman in her early 40s who carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd built a career destroying white-collar criminals. She spent 2 hours documenting my harassment experiences while asking detailed questions about HOA financial procedures and Patricia's management practices. "General Thompson," she said, as our interview concluded, "your flag harassment complaint has revealed what appears to be systematic criminal activity affecting dozens of families. We've identified potential mail fraud, wire fraud, housing discrimination, and conspiracy charges. Mrs. Whitman's attempt to silence your complaint may have been the biggest mistake of her civilian life." The investigation moved forward with the efficiency of a well-planned military operation. Federal agents interviewed residents, reviewed financial records, and built a criminal case that would make Patricia's legal troubles look like a life sentence. The woman who'd fined me for displaying the American flag was facing federal charges that could result in decades in prison. But the story takes an even more satisfying turn when Patricia's desperation led her to commit the kind of mistake that transforms white-collar crime into serious felony charges. Faced with mounting evidence of financial fraud and the possibility of federal prison, Patricia attempted to destroy HOA financial records, forge new documents to hide her embezzlement, and intimidate residents who'd cooperated with federal investigators. Each action added new criminal charges to an already substantial federal case. The document destruction was particularly stupid. Patricia broke into the HOA's office building at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, attempting to shred financial records that federal investigators had already copied during their evidence collection phase. Security cameras captured everything, including her license plate number and facial identification. The intimidation campaign was even worse. Patricia began leaving threatening notes on the cars and mailboxes of residents who'd spoken with federal agents, warning them about the consequences of cooperating with outside authorities investigating community affairs. Each note constituted witness intimidation, a federal felony that carried automatic prison time. Her final mistake was attempting to flee the state when she realized federal charges were imminent. Patricia loaded her BMW with cash, jewelry, and important documents, then drove toward Mexico like some suburban Bonnie without a Clyde. Texas State Police arrested her at a border checkpoint with over $40,000 in cash and evidence of systematic financial fraud. The arrest made local news, then state news, then national news, as the story of HOA harassment escalating into federal criminal charges captured public attention. Patricia Whitman became the poster child for HOA abuse, housing discrimination, and suburban tyranny run amok. The federal trial was everything I'd hoped for and more. United States versus Patricia Ann Whitman opened in federal district court on a crisp October morning that reminded me of successful military operations where careful planning meets perfect execution. Patricia faced 17 felony charges including mail fraud, wire fraud, housing discrimination, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice, with potential sentences totaling over 200 years in federal prison. The prosecution team was led by Assistant United States Attorney Michael Chen, a former military prosecutor who understood both federal criminal law and the unique legal protections afforded to military families. Chen had built his career destroying white-collar criminals who thought their social status and community position would protect them from federal consequences. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its detail. Federal investigators had recovered over 15,000 documents, including Patricia's personal files on targeted residents, bank records showing fraudulent transactions, and recorded phone calls where she discussed strategies for intimidating families who'd challenged her authority. The victim testimony stretched across 4 days of court proceedings, as resident after resident described Patricia's systematic harassment campaign. Margaret Walsh, the 81-year-old widow, testified about receiving violation notices for bird feeders while struggling to maintain her deceased husband's memorial garden. Her voice trembled with dignity as she described Patricia's cruel targeting of elderly residents who couldn't afford legal representation. The Martinez family testified about harassment targeting their son's Navy ROTC participation, with Patricia claiming that military activities created noise disturbances and violated community standards. Maria Martinez broke down crying while describing how Patricia had tried to sabotage her son's military scholarship by filing false complaints with his commanding officers. John Henderson, the Vietnam veteran, provided testimony about systematic financial fraud that had stolen over $30,000 from community funds while residents struggled to afford Patricia's escalating fines and assessments. His military bearing remained intact, as he detailed Patricia's attempts to silence his questions about HOA financial management through escalating harassment and intimidation. The most powerful testimony came from Sarah Kim, the 12-year-old daughter of Korean War veteran David Kim, who'd been targeted for displaying Korean and American flags during cultural heritage celebrations. Sarah's testimony about Patricia's racist comments and discriminatory enforcement brought several jury members to tears while demonstrating the broader civil rights violations underlying Patricia's harassment campaign. The financial evidence painted a picture of sophisticated criminal enterprise that had operated for years with impunity. Forensic accountants testified about complex money laundering schemes involving multiple bank accounts, fake business entities, and fraudulent tax returns designed to hide Patricia's systematic theft from federal authorities. Expert witnesses included former military officers who explained the federal legal protections for flag display and veteran housing rights. Colonel Jennifer Walsh testified about the military's long-standing tradition of flag display and the constitutional principles underlying veteran protection laws. Her testimony established the federal jurisdiction that made Patricia's harassment a serious federal crime rather than simple civil dispute. The defense strategy was pathetic in its desperation and insulting in its assumptions. Patricia's attorney, an expensive criminal defense lawyer from Dallas, attempted to portray her as a dedicated volunteer who had made minor administrative errors while protecting property values for hardworking homeowners. He claimed that federal prosecution was excessive response to simple neighborhood disputes that should have been resolved through civil litigation. The defense argument collapsed when prosecutors presented recorded phone calls where Patricia discussed strategies for driving military families out of the community, described elderly residents as easy targets for harassment, and bragged about her ability to manipulate HOA regulations to punish anyone who challenged her authority. Her own words destroyed any possibility of claiming innocent mistakes or good faith community service. Patricia's testimony in her own defense was a masterpiece of self-destruction that reminded me of enemy commanders who'd sealed their own fate through arrogance and miscalculation. She spent 3 days on the witness stand, attempting to justify her actions, while revealing the depth of her criminal intent and the sophistication of her harassment campaign. When Prosecutor Chen asked Patricia to explain why she'd targeted military families specifically, her response demonstrated the prejudice and discrimination underlying her criminal enterprise. "Military people move frequently," she said, displaying the kind of calculated malice that made jury members visibly angry. "They don't establish deep community roots, so they are less likely to organize sustained legal resistance to necessary community standards." When asked about her systematic embezzlement of community funds, Patricia attempted to claim that her theft was justified compensation for the volunteer work she'd performed as HOA President. "I saved this community hundreds of thousands of dollars through efficient management," she insisted, apparently believing that stealing money was acceptable if you called it administrative efficiency. The jury deliberation lasted less than 4 hours, barely enough time to review the evidence and complete the paperwork for guilty verdicts on all 17 federal charges. The foreman, a retired Air Force Master Sergeant, delivered the verdicts with military precision, while staring directly at Patricia throughout the entire reading. Judge Robert Martinez, the former Navy captain, scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks after conviction, allowing time for pre-sentence investigation and victim impact statements. The Federal Probation Office recommended 25 years in prison, full restitution to all victims, and lifetime supervision following release from federal custody. The victim impact statements provided an opportunity for Patricia's victims to address the court directly about the harm caused by her criminal enterprise. "I chose to wear my dress blue uniform with full ribbons and decorations, representing not just my own service but the military families Patricia had targeted throughout her harassment campaign. Your Honor," I began, my voice carrying 3 decades of military authority and the weight of constitutional obligation, "I served this country for 30 years, defending the Constitution and the rights it guarantees to all Americans." Mrs. Whitman's harassment of military families and her systematic abuse of HOA authority represented everything I spent my career fighting against. Patricia sat at the defendant's table looking like a broken Suburban dictator, her designer tracksuits replaced by orange prison clothing, and her clipboard replaced by handcuffs. The woman who'd thrown my flag in the garbage was learning that federal prison doesn't recognize HOA authority or community standards as valid definitions for criminal behavior. I continued my statement, addressing both the court and the broader issue of HOA abuse that Patricia's case had exposed. Her actions dishonored not just the flag she threw away, but every veteran who served to protect the freedoms she attempted to deny. Military families serve this country with honor and sacrifice, and they deserve communities that respect their service rather than exploit their temporary vulnerability during deployments and transitions. The systematic nature of Mrs. Whitman's crimes demonstrates that this was not simple neighborhood dispute or administrative confusion. She created a criminal enterprise designed to steal from hard-working families while using harassment and intimidation to silence any opposition to her authority. She targeted the most vulnerable members of our community, including elderly residents, military families, and minorities, exploiting their circumstances for personal financial gain. Judge Martinez sentenced Patricia to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, with full restitution of over $900,000 to affected residents. The sentence included forfeiture of all assets derived from her criminal enterprise, including her house, luxury vehicles, and investment accounts funded through systematic theft. But the most satisfying aspect of Patricia's sentence was the special condition requiring her to perform community service at veterans organizations following her release from prison. Judge Martinez specifically required her to work at VA hospitals and veteran service organizations, ensuring that she'd spend years serving the military families she'd targeted during her criminal career. The conviction and sentencing made national news as the HOA harassment story that had escalated into major federal criminal prosecution. Patricia Whitman became a cautionary tale about suburban tyranny, white-collar crime, and the federal consequences of targeting military families through systematic harassment and discrimination. The broader impact extended far beyond individual justice for Patricia's victims. The case established federal precedent for prosecuting HOA harassment as civil rights violations, leading to similar investigations across the country, where military families faced systematic discrimination. The Department of Veterans Affairs created new enforcement mechanisms for investigating housing discrimination against veteran families, while Congress held hearings on HOA reform legislation designed to prevent similar abuse. Willowbrook Estates underwent complete transformation following Patricia's conviction. The new HOA board, elected unanimously after federal investigation, exposed the extent of corruption, implemented financial transparency measures that made future embezzlement impossible. Monthly financial reports became public documents, vendor contracts required competitive bidding with independent oversight, and all board meetings were recorded and made available to residents. The community culture changed dramatically as neighbors who had been isolated by Patricia's harassment campaign began working together to create actual community rather than surveillance state. The annual Independence Day celebration, canceled for 3 years during Patricia's reign of terror, returned as community-wide festival celebrating both American freedom and the local victory over suburban tyranny. Most importantly, my American flag flies proudly from its professional installation, properly illuminated and maintained with military precision. Every morning when I raise the colors, and every evening when I lower them, I think about Sarah and all the Marines who died defending what that flag represents. The Memorial Rose Garden has become a community gathering place where neighbors share stories, children learn about service and sacrifice, and visitors pay respects to military families throughout our area. The Victory Garden, as neighbors now call it, attracts visitors from across Texas who've heard about our successful fight against HOA harassment. Military families facing similar challenges stop by to learn about legal resources and federal protections available to service members dealing with housing discrimination. The garden has become a symbol of resistance to suburban tyranny and proof that ordinary citizens can overcome organized criminal activity through patience, documentation, and federal support. Emma graduated from Georgetown Law School with specialization in veterans' rights and housing discrimination. Her senior thesis, titled Federal Prosecution of Housing Discrimination Against Military Families, cited our case as precedent for aggressive federal enforcement of veteran protection laws. She's now working as prosecutor with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, carrying forward the fight against discrimination wherever it occurs. Michael completed his military service with distinction and decided to pursue career in federal law enforcement, inspired by the FBI agents and federal prosecutors who'd brought justice to our community. He's currently attending the FBI Academy at Quantico, preparing to investigate white-collar crime and civil rights violations with the same dedication his parents brought to military service. 6 months after Patricia's sentencing, I received invitation to speak at the National Association of Attorneys General Conference about federal prosecution of HOA, harassment and housing discrimination. The presentation, attended by prosecutors from all 50 states, provided framework for identifying and prosecuting similar cases of systematic harassment targeting protected classes of residents. The legal precedent established by United States versus Patricia Whitman has been cited in over 40 federal cases involving HOA harassment, housing discrimination, and civil rights violations. The case demonstrates that federal law enforcement takes housing discrimination seriously, regardless of whether the perpetrators are traditional landlords or suburban dictators with clipboards. Last month, I received a letter from a military family in Colorado facing HOA harassment similar to what we'd experienced. Their case involved flag display harassment, discriminatory fine enforcement, and attempts to prevent military family from displaying patriotic decorations during deployment. I connected them with Lieutenant Colonel Kim, Special Agent Santos, and the network of legal professionals who'd helped transform Patricia's harassment into federal case study. The Colorado case resulted in federal investigation that uncovered embezzlement, discrimination, and civil rights violations affecting dozens of military families. 3 HOA board members were indicted on federal charges, while the community received over $2 million in damages and restitution. The case proved that our victory in Texas wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of HOA abuse that requires aggressive federal response. Standing on my back patio this evening, watching the American flag snap in the Texas breeze while Sarah's roses bloom in perfect formation, I'm reminded why we fought so hard for this victory. not just for our right to display the flag with honor, but for every military family who will never have to face the systematic harassment and discrimination that Patricia inflicted on our community. The evening air carries the scent of rose blossoms mixed with the sounds of children playing in yards where families no longer fear harassment for simple acts of patriotism or community participation. Neighbors gather for impromptu barbecues and holiday celebrations, creating the kind of genuine community that Patricia's surveillance state had made impossible for years. The transformation extends beyond individual relationships to institutional changes that protect future residents from similar abuse. The state of Texas passed comprehensive HOA reform legislation requiring financial transparency, limiting harassment authority, and establishing penalties for discrimination against military families. The legislation, nicknamed the Whitman Act by veterans organizations, provides model framework for similar reforms in other states. The federal government updated housing discrimination enforcement procedures to include systematic investigation of HOA harassment complaints, particularly those involving military families and other protected classes. The Department of Veterans Affairs created specialized enforcement unit focused exclusively on investigating housing discrimination against service members, while the FBI established protocols for recognizing and prosecuting HOA harassment as potential federal crimes. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's justice served with military precision, federal authority, and the satisfaction of watching suburban terrorists face the consequences of their own criminal choices. Patricia Whitman learned that lesson from federal prison cell, where clipboard authority means absolutely nothing and criminal behavior receives appropriate federal consequences. The flag flies proudly, the roses bloom beautifully, and justice has been served colder than North Dakota winter. Sarah's memory is honored not just through Memorial Garden, but through successful fight for constitutional rights and community transformation that will protect military families for generations to come. The ripple effects continue expanding as similar cases across America follow our precedent for federal prosecution of HOA harassment. Every successful case makes future harassment less likely, while demonstrating that federal law provides real protection for military families facing discrimination in their own communities. The message is clear. Target military families at your own peril because federal law enforcement takes housing discrimination seriously regardless of suburban setting or HOA authority. Most importantly, we've proven that good people armed with constitutional rights, federal backing, and community support can overcome any suburban dictator who mistakes temporary authority for permanent power. Sometimes you just need to remind them who they're actually dealing with and what happens when civilian criminals target military families in the United States of America. The lessons learned from our battle against Patricia's suburban terrorism have become teaching tools for military families across the nation. The Department of Veterans Affairs now includes our case in their housing rights seminars, while military legal assistance offices use our documentation methods as training materials for service members facing similar harassment. 3 years after Patricia began her federal prison sentence, I received a package from an unexpected source. The return address showed Colorado State Penitentiary, and inside was a handwritten letter from Patricia herself. The letter was a rambling attempt at what might have been an apology, filled with self-pity and excuses for her criminal behavior, but it confirmed something I'd always suspected. She finally understood the magnitude of her mistakes. The letter described her life in federal prison, where clipboard authority meant nothing and criminal behavior received appropriate consequences regardless of suburban social status. She wrote about mandatory anger management classes, financial responsibility seminars, and community service work that had taught her what real community service looked like compared to the power-hungry dictatorship she'd created in Willowbrook Estates. But the most telling part of her letter was her admission that she'd never understood military service or the sacrifices made by the families she'd targeted. Prison had taught her about discipline, respect for authority, and the consequences of abusing power over vulnerable people. She claimed to have learned lessons that should have been obvious to any decent person. But Patricia had needed federal prison to develop basic human empathy. I never responded to Patricia's letter, but I kept it as a reminder that justice sometimes includes unexpected moments of accountability and recognition. The woman who'd thrown my flag in the garbage had finally learned to respect what that flag represents: even if the lesson came through federal prosecution rather than basic decency. The ongoing impact of our victory continues expanding through legislative changes, legal precedents, and community transformations that protect military families from similar harassment. Every successful prosecution of HOA harassment sends a clear message. Target service members at your own peril, because federal law provides real protection backed by serious criminal consequences. Standing here today, 5 years after Patricia threw my flag in the garbage, I can honestly say that her biggest mistake led to one of my greatest victories. Not just personal victory over suburban tyranny, but community-wide transformation that proves American justice works when good people refuse to surrender their constitutional rights to clipboard-wielding dictators. The American flag still flies proudly from its professional installation. Sarah's roses still bloom in perfect formation. And Willowbrook Estates remains a genuine community where neighbors support each other instead of reporting violations. Patricia Whitman learned her lessons from a federal prison cell, but the rest of us learned that ordinary citizens can overcome extraordinary corruption when they refuse to be intimidated by fake authority. Semper Fi, Sarah. Your husband still knows how to win the battles that matter most, and your memory continues inspiring victories for military families across this great nation. What's your worst HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and some are crazy enough for their own federal investigations. Hit that subscribe button if you love seeing bullies get exactly what they deserve. We've got more stories of suburban justice that'll restore your faith in the American legal system. Remember, good people armed with constitutional rights and federal backing can overcome any suburban dictator who mistakes temporary authority for permanent power. Sometimes, you just need to remind them who they're actually dealing with.